Okay, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. So I was trying to get around to say hi to folks, but if I didn't get a chance to meet you, my name is Patrick Manning. I direct the Center for Catholic Studies here. Thank you all for being here with us this morning. We expect to have a really wonderful day together. As some of us heard at Mass, it's a fitting day to be doing this. We're celebrating the feast of Saint Albert the Great, scientist and a man of faith, someone who bridged those worlds of faith and reason. Where more personally for us at Seton Hall, we're named for Elizabeth Ann Seton, America's first native-born saint, who, though not exactly a scientist herself, was the daughter of a physician, a very much an intellectual. She often struck people with her intellectual prowess, and yet obviously also a woman of tremendous faith. So this is something that's very much in our DNA here at Seton Hall. A conversation that we're very happy to be having with all of you. So we have a really wonderful day planned, some fantastic speakers. We are again partnering to bring this event to you with the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. And so they've provided us with several of our speakers and presenters for today. So let me introduce our first. Behind me up here on the screen is Dr. Christopher Baglow. He's the director of the Science and Religion Initiative at the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame, and also professor of the practice in theology there. His work is the culmination of 18 years of faith and science scholarship and educational program creation, as well as a lengthy career in Catholic theological education spanning high school, undergraduate, graduate, and seminary teaching. For this work, he was the co-recipient of an expanded Reason Award in Teaching from the Universidad Francisco de Vitoria and the Vatican Joseph Ratzinger Foundation. Baglow serves as a theological advisor to the board of directors of the Society of Catholic Scientists, as a faith science consultant for the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Catechesis and Evangelization, and as a contributor to the science and religion programming of the Word on Fire Institute. So regarding that work, most recently he authored the transcripts for Wonder, The Harmony of Faith and Science, which is a Word on Fire film series narrated by none other than Jonathan Rumi. So that's quite an honor to have the voice of Jesus reading your works. He's also the author of Faith, Science, and Reason, Theology on the Cutting Edge, and Creation, A Catholic Guide to God and the Universe. He's also terribly good company, so we miss you today here in person, Chris, but we're grateful to you for being here to present. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone, and sorry that I can't be with you today. I have enjoyed my last 2 years at Seton Hall. Regarding St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, I recently discovered that the first textbook, at least in English, on the relationship between faith and science was written by her grandson, William Seton. So for years, I thought I had written the first textbook on faith and science, but he actually did that in like the 19-teens and the 1920s. Just goes to show you, you're never actually first. Somebody's already done it before you. It's a pleasure to be here today to give this presentation. I want to speak to you about the concept of Catholic academic integration, and I want to do that in a few steps. First, I want to talk about the Church's definition of Catholic education, which I'll do in a moment, has two extremely important elements that are referenced or specifically quoted or mentioned in that definition: the light of the gospel and the search for truth. And I think that the relationship between those two can be confusing, even to the most dedicated Catholic educators. So I want to talk a little bit about the paradox. How do we combine the light of the gospel and the search for truth? Then after that, I'd like to look at three areas in which Catholic academic integration can occur, in which we can take the cosmos of, first of all, the physical cosmos, in faith and science, or rather in science, but also the cosmos of human culture in history and literature, and integrate those with faith, doing so in a way in which those disciplines, science, history, and literature, are not kind of invaded by theology or vice versa, but that they are rather brought into a fruitful dialogue with the Catholic faith. And then I'll conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. So let's begin with this question. What is a Catholic education? If you ask most Catholic educators, they will tell you, and correctly, that it has everything to do with a good campus ministry, with good religion programs and teachers, with great social outreaches. And sometimes then the rest is about getting jobs, high test scores, college scholarships, and the like. And I do not disparage that characterization in the least, or I would not. It's a great starting point. And having vital campus ministries and sacramental formation, having great college placement and career success, these are all essential goals to have in education. Even in the universities of the Middle Ages, most students studied only for as long as they needed to become a lawyer or a medical professional. So Catholic education, even back to the great golden age, has always been about getting jobs. But it's also more than that. The church has actually let's see if it'll actually let me advance. Yes, there we go. The church has actually defined what a Catholic education ought to be in our times. First, in 1977, in a document entitled The Catholic School. Once again, in a 2007 document entitled Educating Together in Catholic Schools. And there have been other documents since. But here's the definition that we get in the 2007 document I just referenced. That a Catholic school or a Catholic education is a synthesis between faith, culture, and life, reached by integrating all the different aspects of human knowledge through the subjects taught in the light of the gospel, in an atmosphere characterized by the search for truth. So let's break that down a little bit. Obviously, the subject noun in this definition is a synthesis. In any synthesis, we're trying to bring many elements into a well-ordered whole, an interlocking system. And so a Catholic school is an attempt to create a synthesis between many elements, right? So we might take a step past what most people would define as a Catholic education, even within Catholic schools, and say, okay, yes, it's about jobs, career placement, great test scores, it's about campus ministry, et cetera, and so on. How do all of these things come together? How do we synthesize them? Now, the two components that are being brought together into a well-ordered whole, that are being brought into a synthesis, especially here, are faith and culture, right? Faith and culture. I'm going to focus on those two. By faith, we mean the personal, notice I said personal, not private, the personal, corporate act of faith in which we as believers cling to God by assenting to the truth he reveals as members of the church. It also, of course, refers to the objective faith we profess, which we call the Catholic faith. Culture is the second part of the synthesis that I want to focus on. This word is the subject of entire books. Definitions vary from author to author. In the most recent and most advanced kind of theorizing about evolution, there's even talk of, or a use of the term kind of analogically in regard to animal cultures, right? Well, in our case, no authors would disagree, I think, that culture, excuse me, includes arts and sciences. In other words, academics is a big part of what we mean by culture. And it is the largest part of what we mean by culture when we're talking about a school, any school, including, of course, Catholic schools. So how is such a synthesis created? How do we form this orderly synthesis? What activity does the definition tell us? Or what activity is involved in that, rather? Well, the answer to that question comes in the last part of the definition with the words reached by, right? Reached by integrating all the different aspects of human knowledge through the subjects taught in the light of the gospel, an atmosphere characterized by the search for truth. So let's call this activity Catholic academic integration. So the Catholic school or a Catholic education is, at its heart, academic integration in the light of the gospel characterized by the search for truth. The prepositional phrase in the light of the gospel and the adverbial phrase characterized by the search for truth tell us what is meant by Catholic academic integration. You have there in those last two phrases, in a nutshell, what the rest of my presentation today is about, integrating the curriculum in the light of the gospel. Now, as I noted in my outline, those two phrases are easily misunderstood, and in fact, they can seem at first glance to be in contradiction. Let's try to savor, to actually taste the paradox created by the two phrases. In the light of the gospel, characterized by the search for truth. The fact that those two can be combined in this definition reveals something about both the light of the gospel and the search for truth. So the light of the gospel is not a truth we have found through searching, but the truth that has found us, that has claimed us for his own. Jesus Christ is the truth of the gospel. But in claiming us, paradoxically, he has called us to search for truth. In claiming us for his own, God has not taken away from us the adventure of discovery. He's done the exact opposite. He has bestowed that adventure on us, and he holds us responsible for undertaking it. So, God's ownership of my life in faith, in the gospel, is a freedom for the truth, and it's a responsibility for the truth. Now we can dwell a bit on the last phrase, an atmosphere characterized by the search for truth. I once asked a fellow theologian to describe to a group of teachers why he is a Catholic. This was right off the cuff. He said, well, there are many reasons, but one of the most important, he said, is this. Never have I seen some feature of the real world that is obviously true, that makes sense, that can't be denied without being absurd, and been told by the church, no, you must not accept that. Never have I been told to close my mind to the truth that I find. So the Catholic school, then, is a place where all truths are welcome. So what makes a Catholic school different from any other place where people search for truth? The difference is not in what truths are allowed to be seen. The difference is the supernatural light in which all truths are seen, the light of God that illuminates them. God's light is not a light that changes the truth seen, but a light that shows it to us in its fullest magnitude, shows us how to make sense of it, how to relate ourselves to it. When I see the reality of biological evolution in a Catholic school, for example, I see what any other biology student sees, and I see all that they see. But in a Catholic school, I see more. I see that this natural process is God sharing his goodness with creation, letting creatures in, so to speak, on the act of creation. Even when I see the unsettling things, velociraptor claws, brain-destroying amoebas, deadly viruses, in the light of the gospel, I do not fail to see that God is so good that he not only causes creatures to be, but he causes them to be causes of one another, creating a cosmos, which means an orderly arrangement in the original Greek. This is the truth about evolution that is seen when the light of the gospel is allowed to shine on it. And the fact that the cosmos is itself a synthesis of many different things into an orderly whole justifies our definition of Catholic education as a synthesis. The academic synthesis we're trying to inspire, to stimulate, to engender in the souls of our students is a reflection of the synthesis that God has created in the cosmos and in human history and life. So let's consider a specific discipline in this regard, science. The Catholic school is an atmosphere characterized by the search for truth. How do we translate this part of our rule of life from the general to the particular, from the general description of a Catholic school into an integration of the study of the natural sciences into a Catholic education? Well, in regard to our definition, an atmosphere characterized by the search for truth, it means an atmosphere characterized by the sound principles of scientific investigation, period. It means doing good science first without reference to anything but the methods and scope proper to the natural sciences, the study of the natural world. This is the Catholic view. It comes from an important distinction between the way God the Creator is and acts and the way God's creatures are and act. So when the greatest pupil of St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose birth we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of this very year, when he wrote about the creation narrative in the book of Genesis and made reference to understanding the temporal beginnings of the universe, he said, oops, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had that in there, pardon me. He said, in the first founding of the order of nature, we must not look for miracles, but for what is in accordance with nature. In another place, he uses the analogy of a shipbuilder and a ship. It is as if a shipbuilder, he's talking about nature. It is as if a shipbuilder were able to give to timbers that by which they would move themselves to take the form of a ship. In other words, we must study nature as it acts, recognizing that God establishes the order of nature, and so we can study it and understand it on its own terms. The cosmos has laws and patterns, cause and effect relationships and systems of its own that are proper to it and by no means governed by divine micromanagement. According to the Catholic faith, this legitimate autonomy of the cosmos is willed by God. And so the legitimate autonomy of the natural and human sciences, which study the cosmos, is taught by the Church. Consider this quote from the Second Vatican Council's document, Gaudium et Spes. The Church, we read there, does not forbid that the human arts and disciplines use their own principles and their proper method, each in its own domain. Therefore, acknowledging this just liberty, this sacred synod affirms the legitimate autonomy of human culture and especially of the sciences. The Catholic Church embraces scientific investigation and sees it as indispensable for understanding the cosmos. So if a Catholic school is an atmosphere characterized by the search for truth, then it must include bold scientific investigation. We've been focused on the last phrase in our definition. Now we turn to the second to the last again, that the integration of the subjects taught with their various searches for truth occurs in the light of the gospel. The Catechism defines the gospel in Catechism number 1846 as follows. The gospel is the revelation in Jesus Christ of God's mercy to sinners. By the gospel, we also mean the good news of the kingdom of God. My favorite definition of the kingdom of God comes from my great theological mentor, a Cistercian monk named Father Roch Koreshi of happy memory. He died in December of 2022. He's pictured here with my daughter, Margaret. Margaret is the one on the left. And his definition of the kingdom of God is the hidden but powerful presence of God in Jesus, restoring wholeness of life to all those who accept him in faith. I'll repeat. The hidden but powerful presence of God in Jesus, restoring wholeness of life to all those who accept him in faith. Now, how do we know that this is what the gospel is? How do we know that this is what the kingdom of God is? If these were empirically verifiable, then every reasonable person would be Catholic. If they were common, easily established facts accepted by the consensus of scientists based on a series of experiments, then every reasonable scientist would be Catholic. But they are neither empirically nor in any other method verifiable. They can't be squeezed onto a slide or dug out of the ground. They can only be known through faith. Their proofs are modest and few. The proofs of the truth of the gospel and the kingdom do not force the intellect to accept them. Force, intellectual or otherwise, comes from the impatience of men, and the world is destroyed by that impatience. The gospel is the announcement of the patience of God, and the world is saved by it. The freest thing we will ever do is believe the gospel. In the face of empirical evidence, we have only virtual freedom. We must accept what it shows or be insane or a liar, or at least disingenuous. But those who accept the gospel could have every earthly reason not to do so. And to accept it is to accept, as St. Paul says, the foolishness of God. But that's not all he says. He adds that the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. So with this refresher on what we mean by the gospel, we can now hopefully begin to bring it all together and understand what we mean by academic integration in the light of the gospel. And there are a number of things being claimed by this short phrase. The first is the most challenging. It is that the adjective Catholic should never be reduced to one subject. In the light of the gospel means that the gospel is a way of seeing that is capable of containing all the disciplines. It is a wisdom wider than them all, and it embraces the wisdom of them all. In the light of the gospel means, as C.S. Lewis says, or in the words of C.S. Lewis, I should have said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. This is a light that shines from behind the eye as we see, not one that shines on the eye from outside. This means that in a Catholic school, we must bring our students to ask the question, what do these things we study, taken together as a whole, mean? And this is where the Catholic faith shines its powerful light on the pictures of reality developed in our various disciplines. If a Catholic school were simply to say, we're Catholic because we have religion classes, then it would not be living up to this rule of life. If this sounds a bit too abstract, consider this. What is this a picture of? Depending on how you process the visual cues, you see either the profile of a rather haggard-looking old woman or the image of a beautiful young woman looking away from the field of the picture. Notice that you can't reduce the young woman to the old woman or the old woman to the young woman. The same visual data belongs to both visions of the picture. People often use this image to say that what you see depends on interpretation, but that does not say enough. Notice that the issue cannot be interpretation of the details of the picture. Those remain the same, whether you want to argue that you see an old woman or a young woman in the picture. Everybody sees a bonnet. Everybody sees hair. Everybody sees a female. Some details are disputable. Is that an eye or is it an ear? But notice that you can't answer that question until you have decided whether it is an old woman or a young woman. So ultimately, the decision that this is an old woman or that this is a young woman is an interpretation that must happen outside of the picture in a way that transcends the picture. If I argue that the picture is actually a picture of a horse, then the details within the picture defeat my argument. But if I argue that it is an old woman, then no details defeat me. Rather, in this kind of interpretation, I am not determining what the details are, but rather, I am determining myself in regard to the details and the whole picture. And this is analogous to what we mean by integrating subjects in the light of the gospel, or integrating faith across the curriculum. We see these objects of study in the light of God, God who is not a detail of the curriculum, or a topic of one course, but again, the light shining on all courses. And in each case, these objects of study bring us to see the reality anew within that light. Does this mean, as I've asked before, that every class should become a religion class? No. Is it successfully accomplished by making sure we have a crucifix in the English classroom, or by making sure we begin every physics class with a prayer? We certainly should have both of those things, but no. It means teaching our subjects in ways and with attention to the big questions that the gospel answers. Who am I? What is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything? Why is this object of study good, beautiful, and true? It means creating a faculty that engages in interdisciplinary dialogue behind the scenes, but also in front of and with their students, so that students can see how all the things they learn relate to these big questions and to their Christian faith. And here's a daring proposition, in doing so, not only will this serve the Catholic identity of the school or the Catholic identity of the students, but it will actually help them understand the rich and the specific value of the discipline being taught, whether it's biology, mathematics, Western literature, Old Testament, or any other discipline. Let me give you an example. Integrating faith and science is the area that I have devoted the majority of my research and teaching since 2005. And in that context, I can say that openness to the big questions and to faith actually is a better way to teach science than to teach it without integration. From 2014 through 2016, I worked with the faculty of St. Mary's Dominican High School in New Orleans on integrating their curriculum around faith. Before I started, the science department had ingeniously decided to cover and recover the scientific method at the beginning of each of the final 3 years of the curriculum, sophomore, junior, and senior years. For 1 week, the teachers would go back over the scientific method with the students in general, and then conclude by explaining how the scientific method applies in this specific course. And by the way, they taught biology, chemistry, and physics at those levels, sophomore, junior, and senior, respectively. On the basis of the faculty science and religion seminars and reading and discussion that we did in 2014, The science department, rather, decided to add 10 to 15 minutes to each of those weeks to teaching the difference between the scientific method and the methods of discovery used in philosophy and theology. 15 minutes, 1-5. So here's one point they started making, which you've probably heard me if you've been here in the to this event in the past. Science takes things apart to tell us how they work. Religion or the Bible brings things together to see what they mean. In the meantime, the religion department, inspired by that, decided to do the same in reverse, covering theological method and then contrasting it with the scientific method. In both departments, the value and goodness of the other discipline was thoroughly affirmed as part of this. So, science can't tell you why the universe exists, but religion, faith can. Religion, faith can't tell you about the process by which the various forms of life developed, but biology can. The result was splendid. Simply distinguishing science and religion according to their methods helped students see better what they were doing in each class and why they needed both religion and science to understand the world fully. The conflict model of science and religion, which studies tell us has been embraced by as many as 70% of young Catholics today, was radically challenged and put to rest right from the start. They had distinguished science and religion. Now they could show how they are united. But it had another great result. Through distinguishing science from religion and religion from science, the specific object of each discipline became clearer to the betterment of both. They became better science students because they understood that they weren't answering the big questions about life, the universe, and everything. They became better students in their religion classes when they understood that trying to find answers like the one science gives in religion is to miss the point. To riff on the words of our Lord, "He who would save his discipline to the detriment of others will lose it, but he who loses his discipline briefly for the sake of Catholic academic integration will find it." Thanks to this attention to integration, Dominican girls no longer expected conflict between science and religion. They no longer naively assumed the doctrine of creation or the biblical creation accounts and the Big Bang Theory to be rival explanations for the physical universe. They felt free to study and possibly embrace both. What about history? History, I propose, should be about creating a Catholic memory for the sake of a greater future. This means that events of the Church's past should be brought under theological evaluation, both doctrinal and ethical evaluation from a Catholic way of seeing. And not just the Church's past, but the history of the world itself. It will not simply be the adoption of content quotas or performance standards, but it must always be about rising to a judgment of the past enlightened by faith. It will see the past with the eyes of the Church, including seeing the Church's own past with the eyes of the Church, for those eyes are enlightened by the gospel. We believe, continuing here, we believe that the Church is the seed and the beginning of the kingdom of God. But we realize that only the eyes of faith can see this while looking at her visible reality. We should not approach the details of her history expecting always to find clear confirmation of her spiritual reality, of her supernatural origin. We will either, if we do that, then we will ultimately ruin our search for truth. We will either cease to be Catholic because we did not find the perfect holiness and virtue we foolishly expected to find, or we will engage in crude apologetics in which we try to justify things in the name of the faith that should never be justified, and leave ourselves and our students ashamed before the world in doing so. We should rather examine the history of the church with the same dedication and lack of rationalization with which we should examine our own consciences. The Catholic Church is a living society spanning 20 centuries. She has a memory, and in this memory stand out incredible models to imitate, saints like St. Albert the Great or St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, incredible movements for good, but this good wheat always remains inextricably mixed with weeds. Holiness stands side by side with infidelity and sin. So when we evaluate the past and see great things done in the church like hospitals, care for the poor, and marvelous love in the lives of the saints, we see the work of God and the holiness of the church. But when we see violence, anti-Semitism, forced conversions, we see the work of men closing themselves to the work of God in his holy church. The key here is that to fully integrate faith and history, it's not that we have to see just one or the other. We have to see both. For if we are honest, we will admit that we ourselves and that the church now is a mixture of both, even as we speak. This slide refers to the great moment in the late 1990s where John Paul II brought the church through a purification of memory and preparation for the advent of the third millennium. And he pointed to 4 areas in particular in which the church should recognize the dark moments in her history and speak to the world in a way that is almost like a corporate repentance for them. Christian disunity, violence in service of the truth, anti-Semitism, and atheism. So when we look at the church's past, we must do so with unshakable faith in the holiness of the church and its power to be a sacrament of salvation for us. A history class that leaves any doubt about that is not fit for a Catholic school. But this does not mean pretending that the sanctification process happens immediately, or that it is demonstrated by pretending that the church's members do the right thing every time, all of the time. Oh, sorry, excuse me. One of the things we did at St. Mary's Dominican High School was go with the teachers through a series of primary readings entitled Catholicism and Slavery. Let me give you a couple of facts about the church and slavery as an illustration of this. From 1629 to 1788, popes actually purchased slaves for use in the pontifical squadron, most of whom were Muslims captured in war. Second fact, in 1866, just 1 year after the end of the Civil War, and after Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural, to my mind, the greatest speech in American history, in which he condemned slavery as an offense God's providence has now removed. The Holy Office, renamed at Vatican II, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, declared, quote, "It is not contrary to the natural and divine law for a slave to be bought, sold, exchanged, or donated." Now, taken by themselves, and out of any historical context, one might take these 2 instances to conclude that the church is and always has been a pro-slavery, anti-human institution. Nothing could be further from the truth. We don't have time today to pursue why that is a false judgment, which is why, well, perhaps I can send along a QR code and give you access to the materials that we studied at Dominican later. I don't have it in this set of slides. But a great research project for an American, European, or church history course would be to study exactly what was going on with slavery and the Catholic Church. I'll simply end this section by quoting an article by my colleague Corey Hayes which I'll also include in that folder with the QR code later. He wrote in an essay, holiness in the church has not and does not always correspond to the holiness of the church. And this state of affairs is, excuse me, and this state of affairs is a sin and a scandal. But the entrance of God into human history, accomplished in the incarnation, offers hope that real human progress can end the sad poetry of the ages. Finally, and I believe I've saved the most important for last, literature and faith. I honestly believe that literature has the capacity to bring a student closer to God than even their religion class. Because within great literature, a student is brought to direct contemplation of beauty, of good and evil, of the transcendent, of the sacred and the profane. I'm a theologian, so I am kind of deprecating my own discipline here. But theology thinks about divine and human mysteries in the abstract. In great literature, those mysteries are experienced directly. A Catholic imagination is more important to formation, A Catholic imagination is more important to formation than a perfect memorization and recall of the Church's doctrines. We need to only recall that Jesus told many more stories than he ever made doctrinal pronouncements. Before I go on, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine a Jewish high school with a literature department. You have a chance to review the books included in their curriculum. And when you read through it, you notice that not one of the modern masterpieces of Jewish literature has been included. No The Chosen by Chaim Potok. No short stories from the periodic table by Primo Levi, the Jewish Italian chemist and Holocaust survivor. Not even Silence by Elie Wiesel has been included. If I were in your shoes, I would feel an immense sense of loss and even anger at what seems like a complete lack of respect for the religious heritage of the school and most of its students. Well, sadly, that is precisely what I have seen at countless American Catholic high schools. No Flannery O'Connor, no Graham Greene or Evelyn Waugh. Shoot a military cannon through the literary canon of the school and you won't kill a single Catholic author. At Notre Dame, in my theology course, I have my students interpret Flannery O'Connor's short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, using love in both its objective and subjective dimensions as the lens through which they read a great work of literature, applying a supernatural vision to fiction. There's one example in which a modern Catholic author could be included in a literature course. So what else can be said? I'm about to say something that might sound like I'm being insulting, but please don't take it that way. I recommend that at every Catholic school, the English department go through the curriculum and rid it of prescription fiction. Prescription fiction can be defined as any fiction written like an ABC after-school special from the 1980s. You know, a novel about the senior basketball team captain who drinks and drives and kills his friend in an accident and then ultimately kills himself out of despair. Or the novel that sentimentally delivers the sweet poison that ultimately, if you follow your heart, you will always be fulfilled and happy, just as long as you do what feels right. Are those novels that glorify adolescence as a special window into everything true that older people will never understand? Prescription fiction of any kind, the moralizing religious kind, or the demoralizing nihilistic kind, or the secular moralizing all things will go well with you if you designate a driver kind, all of those are simply false. These bad novels are badly disguised safety pamphlets, masquerading as literature that leave young people incapable of understanding the tragic mystery of human existence. Well, what then about this kind of literature? This is often, these three works are often found in Catholic secondary education, or at least were when I was in Catholic school, shortly after the Civil War. Well, consider this quote. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. The fate of men and beasts are the same fate awaits both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal. Those bleak words come from the book of Ecclesiastes. We recognize the book of Ecclesiastes as inspired sacred scripture. And if those words can be the word of the Lord in sacred scripture, then we have to say yes, the great existential fiction of, say, Camus, or of Golding, or of Salinger, can have a place in Catholic education. The problem is when they have the pride of place, when they become the final word, when they are not surrounded by books which help readers to look beyond death and tragedy, to hope with a realism that, yes, life will make you suffer, but also that suffering lovingly for another or for what is right is a more beautiful and meaning life than one of despair. Don't stop there. Have them read a recent masterpiece like The Road by Cormac McCarthy. Listen to this bit from the beginning of this book about a father and his young son trying to go forward with hope after the end of the civilized world and the destruction of everything. When he woke in the woods, in the dark and the cold of the night, he'd reach out to touch the child sleeping beside him. Nights dark beyond darkness, and the days more gray, each one than what had gone before. His hand rose and fell softly with each precious breath. With the first gray light, he rose and left the boy sleeping and walked out to the road and squatted and studied the country to the south. Barren, silent, godless. He knew only that the child was his warrant. He said, if he's not the word of God, then God never spoke. The question of God, the meaning of life, of incredible love is raised throughout. It's a question in suspense. The novel does not answer the question, but it does better. It leaves the reader trying to answer it. The one I recommend above all is by another agnostic like Cormac McCarthy, Thornton Wilder. His Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Bridge of St. Louis Rey. If you want to encounter the absolute mystery of divine providence and the primacy of love in fiction, you will not find it anywhere if you can't find it there. Wilder said that the central idea of the book stemmed from arguments with his father, a strict Calvinist of the Puritan variety. He said, my father was a man of religious conviction. My religion was gone before I missed it, like a coat left in some railway station. I give these two examples, McCarthy and Wilder, because by no means does integrating matters of faith across the curriculum require that we rely upon the work of confirmed believers. Here's a rule of thumb, once again from Wilder, that I think can help us as we apply it in integrating literature and faith. He said, the business of literature is not to answer questions, but to state them fairly. And The Bridge of St. Louis Rey is one of the most fair and amazing statements of the ultimate questions I have ever encountered, and a piece of utterly brilliant prose. Wilder peered deeply into reality, and what he saw was the Catholic understanding of love, though it's not even clear that he knew that was what he was doing. Oops. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to jump out there. So once again, the task that's before us as Catholic educators, working in secondary education and in other contexts, is to create a synthesis between faith, culture, and life. To do this by integrating all the different aspects of human knowledge through the subjects taught in the light of the gospel in an atmosphere characterized by the search for truth. I hope that this presentation today has been helpful for you as you think about ways in which this can happen more and more at your own schools. And as we do so, we have one of the greatest examples of it in history today to pray for us. So St. Albert the Great, pray for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. Really wonderful, really wonderful. So based on feedback that we've received in recent years, we wanted to give everyone more time for conversation, for workshopping, for applying what you've been hearing in conversation. So we have less time for questions right now, but maybe we could take at least one question for Dr. Baglow before we let him go. So anything percolating for anyone? Or has he solved all of life's mysteries for you in 50 minutes?
I'll get things going with heck. I like what you stated conceptually. How do I put this stuff into practice?
Well, I'm going to share a couple of QR codes with some exact examples of assignments. The one I mentioned about Catholicism and slavery, and the one that I mentioned about literature. Obviously, that would just be a beginning, but hopefully what I've said today helps you focus in on what you should be thinking about when you teach your courses, right? You need to begin with principles and then move towards reality. So I'll offer a couple of examples of that with that QR code. Does that sound good?
Okay, great. Yeah, and as I said, we'll have another talk after our break, and then some time for us to really kind of dig in and table conversation and kind of generate some of those practical ideas within this group. Okay. All right, let's thank Dr. Baglow one more time. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Okay, so we have a little time now. If everyone wants to get up, stretch their legs, can refresh your coffee. The bathrooms are going to be all the way down the hall and then around the corner to the left. And then in about 10 minutes' time, we'll resume. Okay, so we'll be back shortly. I was going to say, I thought I was louder before. Okay, folks. All right, so I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker. Heather Foucault-Cam is the Program Director of the Science and Religion Initiative at the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame. Prior to beginning her work at the McGrath Institute, she was a classroom teacher for 15 years with subject-specific experience in chemistry, physics, and bioethics. She has taught in Canada, the UK, and here in the United States, and holds degrees in chemistry from the University of Ottawa in Canada, also in science education from the University of Leeds in the UK, and in theology from the University of Notre Dame. And I learned last night that she's working on a PhD right now. She is also a wife and mother of 2 children, and in her spare time, that's got to be a joke, in your spare time, she enjoys playing ice hockey, practicing martial arts, she's actually a black belt, and running. So if you're feeling unsafe at any point during the day, you just stay close to her. On a personal note, I just wanted to add that Heather and generally speaking, our friends from McGrath have been just incredibly gracious and accommodating collaborators. Heather has really been our point contact person with Notre Dame. So we're just immensely grateful, not only for this talk, but all that you've contributed to our work here at Seton Hall over the years. So please join me in welcoming Heather Foucault-Cam.
I just wanted to say thank you to our friends at Seton Hall, Patrick and Matthew. Friends, this has been our third year of a most wonderful and edifying collaboration, and I'm profoundly grateful to be here again. It's such a gift to be with all of you. I am Canadian for my sins, but I have removed all the extraneous yous from my talk. Apologies if you catch one. There can be a door prize for that, and I will be careful about saying OUT and ABOUT, and anyone who knows Canada will know what I'm talking about. Friends, I also have a handout for today. It's on the table. It has all the key quotes that I'm speaking to, so you can feel free to grab it as I'm talking, or after I'm done if you want to grab it. It also has my email should you want to contact me later. So as Patrick said, I am the program director for the Science and Religion Initiative. Prior to this work, I was a classroom teacher for 15 years in a high school, and before that, a professor and researcher in the field of chemical physics. What business do I have talking about all this today? Well, it's very interesting, and I hear the question about kind of the practicality of what we're proposing with respect to academic integration. And it was about 10 years ago now when I taught a course in science and religion and ethics at a Catholic school. We were approaching our final project with the students, and it was 50% of their grade. The criteria for this project, and I had such academic freedom at the school, the criteria were fairly broad, right? The topic that the students chose had to have a scientific element, all right? And there must be some point or some component of ethical or moral controversy. My objective was to have the students think through a contemporary scientific issue from a rational, physical, and from a legal and theological mindset, right? Integration of human knowledge in the light of the gospel. A senior at the time approached me with a proposal, and my eyes were opened. And she felt compelled, she said, to present the life and legacy of Henrietta Lacks. In all honesty, as an immigrant to the United States, I had no idea what she was proposing, and as a chemist who knows very little about biology, I had no idea about Henrietta's legacy to the medical community. However, I was also aware that the freedom of the institutions in which we operate allow these students, or actually kind of compel us to permit these students to investigate the truth fully. Following the student's presentation, I understood why this high school senior felt very strongly about committing, again, 50% of her grade to the study of Henrietta Lacks. What we will see today is that this one cell line, and we'll talk about all these biology words, is representative of precisely why science cannot wait to rediscover a consistent and authentic relationship to the human good and a life-affirming moral order. Furthermore, it is in the fertile soil of the Catholic school where we are most free to educate our students on precisely why such conversations need to be had now. In choosing to discuss Henrietta's story today, a work of nonfiction for our literature teachers, which requires technical and scientific understanding, math and science colleagues, to add the additional elements of knowledge required to understand the moral offense that is present, philosophy, ethics, moral theology, the work entitled The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks represents an intriguing example of what is meant by a Catholic school, being a synthesis, right? Faith and culture and life, reached by integrating all the subjects taught in the light of the gospel. But before we go any further, I want to pause and turn to the Lord and humbly petition for his blessing on the work we do together in this next 45 minutes. What I would like to do is seek the intercession of St. Josephine Paquita, the patron saint of Sudan, who spent much of her early life in slavery and who entered the church and the Canossian Daughters of Charity when she was finally freed in January of 1890. For the next 42 years, she worked as a cook and a doorkeeper at the convent.
She also traveled and visited other convents to tell her story. She was known for her gentle voice and smile. She was charismatic and was often lovingly referred to as the little brown sister, or honorably as the Black Mother. So if you would join me in praying together in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Loving God, rewarder of the humble, you bless Saint Josephine Bakhita with charity and patience. May her prayers help us and her example inspire us to carry our cross and love you always. Pour upon us as the spirit of wisdom and love which you filled Saint Josephine Bakhita. By serving as she did, may we please you by our faith and actions. We grant this through our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Saint Josephine Bakhita, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Now, for me, and I approach this as a chemist, I own that. Any biologists in the room? Brilliant. Brilliant. All right. It's mind-blowing to think that so much of what we take for granted medically in the 21st century has been made possible by just one cell. To be fair, one cell line, but I'll explain this to you in a moment. Which advances? The basis for the polio vaccine, significant innovations in chemotherapy, understanding the link between certain viral illnesses and cancer, and expanding knowledge of and treatment for the human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. These are but a few giant leaps in medicine that have been made possible by something that could easily and several times over fit on a pin's head. Even our understanding of how COVID-19 makes us sick can be linked to this one cell line. But how is this possible? What's so special? The HeLa cell line represents the very first so-called immortal cell line, and thus the very first collection of cells whose reproduction we could sustain indefinitely. With the discovery of this cell line in the 1950s, we were able to test therapies and the cellular response to the environment on a fundamental building block of the human body. This is a very important first step in the clinical trial process. But, and based on what we've just heard from Chris, our discussion today cannot and should never be just about science. Because what many people do not know, including myself 10 years ago, or for some choose not to engage, is that the HeLa cell line, as old as it is, as prolific as it is only known to the world because it came from someone. Henrietta Lacks, a Black woman who died in 1951 of an aggressive form of cervical cancer. It was cells taken from her without her consent that are a key part of the medical advances that I have previously listed, chemotherapy, COVID, and the like. This cell line nets the cell line nets annually billions of dollars. By contrast, Henrietta's descendants spent a large portion of their lives, her immediate descendants, in poverty and unable to access the very same medical care that would have been impossible without their mother. As a case study, Henrietta Lacks and the cell line that now survives her confronts us all with the question of how we should do research and the legacy of mistrust in the scientific and medical establishment that persists in some communities in this country and beyond. Our Catholic understanding of human dignity as it relates to the common good, the commitment integral to our faith to work towards the flourishing of each person and every person without exception, is a powerful reminder of our responsibilities to each other, not merely as neighbors, but as sisters and brothers. And in his 1983 medical address to the World Medical Association, Pope St. John Paul II offered us the following guidance, about what medicine or research should be doing. And to kind of open the door for some audience participation, would anyone like to take a crack at reading the blue box for us?
What must be established definitively is whether medicine is indeed at the service of the human person, of his dignity, of what he has, of the unique and of the transcendent, or whether medicine is considered, first of all, as the agent of the community.
I thank you. And so while we realize that there are scientists, theologians, ethicists, operating and wrestling with this right now as we speak. The question becomes, as we think about our vocation as educators, how do we prepare students to get there, right? And we cannot just prepare them in a science classroom, all right? In this statement, we see elements of science, we see elements of the law, and we'll talk about the law later as I understand it. We see elements of theology, all right? All the subjects taught in the light of the gospel. And so what I propose for our objectives today is we're going to go back to what Chris said about the Catholic school, very briefly to ground this discussion, which at its heart is kind of a pedagogical model for how you could do some of the things that he's talking about. So I'm going to ground this in what a school is. I would like to be able to talk about what the HeLa cells are, because we have all heard about embryonic stem cells. Hands up if you've heard about stem cells before. Okay, perfect. We've all heard about these stem cells, right? Particularly within the context most recently of the COVID vaccine, all right, and discussions about its licitness, all right? But I would argue we have a similar set of concerns when we consider this cell line as well, all right? And so it's really kind of walking through that process with you to both form the formators and also talk about how, again, when we think about integration, how a single text can be used as grounding conversations in multiple different disciplines as we approach this capital T truth. And so to go back to what Chris said about this synthesis, what I'd like to focus on, all right, is that idea of truth, right? The Catholic school shapes its students to live a life fully aware of the complexity of creation and their duty to be responsible stewards of it. Furthermore, the atmosphere of our schools is one that is characterized, again, by the search for truth, capital T, right? So not truth as, when we talk about, is it true that Notre Dame is going to win the national championship this year? Obviously, if you go to campus right now, we're all like, yes, they will. They're going to get a home football game. No, we're going to talk about capital T truth, right? Again, this idea of this synthesis of the subjects taught in the light of the gospel. Again, like Chris said, not suggesting that your science class become a theology class, but understanding that these puzzle pieces, if you will, are held together by this larger reality that helps us see creation as it is. And my friends, in terms of teaching to the interests of your students, all right, when I taught ethics, I asked the students, all right, so if I'm going to teach at the intersection of science and religion, I had the blessing in my science classroom of having, or science schedule rather, of having the opportunity to have like a free kind of class period. So naturally, what am I going to do with like my spare time? I'm going to teach, right? So I taught science and religion, and I asked the students about practical examples of the intersection of science and religion for them. So they're thinking about putting these pieces together. Where do they see those pieces fitting together? So this is kind of a representative example of their answers to that initial question in the 3 years that I taught before I left the classroom and returned to the academy. Can anyone see any common themes here? I put them in green for a reason. No? Interestingly, this was 10 years ago when they were paranoid about robots and self-driving cars. Isn't that fascinating? They're anticipating, right? They have this wonderful, if not eerie, ability to forecast the future. So when you ask the students where they see the integration of science and religion, I'm going to give you my hot take on the theme and why I wrote this in green, and then I'm interested in your thoughts, all right? For them, the intersection of science and religion very much involves biotechnology, right? I literally took the guardrails off and said, ask me a question, all right? Now look at all the themes, right? They're very curious about how science relates to them and their bodies. When we consider this line of inquiry from the students and then overlay it with what we do at SRI, we see a model, a potential model for your acceptance or resistance, however you see this, for how we can teach science and religion, right? What is one practical way that we can teach at that intersection? And I would argue that through the lens of bioethics, there's a very fertile ground for this, right? The students want to understand how this works. At the age that they're developing, for them, all right, it's very much about what is concrete and what they can see. And so for them, it's the ethics. I would argue that we have a powerful touch point in the field of biotechnology. We're going to bring in the other subjects in a moment as we unfold Henrietta's story. So what I propose moving forward is sort of a 2-for-1 deal, right? In one sense, I'm going to explain the HeLa cell line and its moral considerations and controversies. I also encourage you, friends, if you know this area very well, please weigh in, raise your hands. If we don't get to the absolute end of these comments because we're having a fruitful conversation, that's a win. In a second sense, 2-for-1, I want to model for you an integrated instructional approach, taking this single work, again, of nonfiction, exploring academic areas of inquiry that contribute to the story, and then evaluating the issue at hand with knowledge of the natural world, most definitely, yes, but also as illuminated by the gospel. So let us begin with what is easiest first, and that is, what do we mean by a cell line? So friends, who remembers biology class? Awesome, yeah, good. I remember it, only vaguely, it's been a while. But friends, in order to understand what happened to Henrietta, right, if we're going to examine this, right, and the cell line that survives her, a good place to start would be with biology. To answer the question precisely what was done to Henrietta will require a level of familiarity with the terms cell line and immortal cell line. But let us look first at the cell. On your left, I am told, I am a humble chemist after all, right? The cell is the basic building block of our bodies. By analogy, if you think about a Lego tower, the tower would be our bodies and the individual Legos could be our cells, all right? So very crude analogy. Now, we all know that a single Lego brick is made up of even smaller things. As a chemist, I dealt with the science of the tiny, or DNA. But for the purposes of our time, together today, we will keep our discussion to the cellular, or Lego brick level. Now, friends, part of the reason why we grow is that our cells divide, a process that is rapid in children, and as I am finding post my 40th birthday, this slows down as we age. This process of cell division normally takes place within the body, right? That makes absolute logical sense. As such, it is difficult for scientists to replicate this process outside of the body, right? Even when they create what should be appropriate for the cells to divide. This represents a problem for medical research. Why? Why is this a problem for medical research? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Well, you can't study, there's no way you can study what happens to the cell if the cell doesn't live outside the human body, because you can't technically do it inside the human body.
Boom, absolutely. Anybody else have anything to add? When you think about the clinical trial process, all right, would you want to try something that was untested, right? Whose effects are unknown? No. There is a process. We can speak to that in the Q&A if you so wish, all right? But you're absolutely right, ma'am, right? Without our ability to study these things outside of the body, all right, in the first pass, we don't necessarily know how they're going to work inside the body, all right, what they're going to do to us. Again, I'm not trying to argue that outside the body is a perfect example for what goes on inside the body, but it gives us some clues, all right? Now, a cell line is a group of cells that behave in the same way, right? Doing this on one cell, all right, even as a chemist, I understand that's a little bit ridiculous. I know these things get together, all right, they work in concert, all right? So a cell line is a group of cells that behave in the same way. A mortal cell line, by extension, has the ability to undergo the process of cell division indefinitely. Now, that only happens due to a mutation or a mistake in the cell. This is good in the lab. As real science, is it a one and done deal, real science? You do it once and then you're like, see ya. No, right? We have to replicate the conditions, all right? Check, check, and double check, all right? The HeLa cell line, all right? So now we have cell line, immortal cell line. The HeLa cell line, he for Henrietta, L-A, la for lax, was the very first immortal cell line. Meaning it could do what? Divide indefinitely, and that this division could be sustained outside of the body in a petri dish with the right conditions. Prior to HeLa cells, scientists had struggled to support cell division outside the body or in vitro. In 1951, Dr. George Gay, so we're now transitioning to the history, noticed that cells taken from a specific biopsy from Henrietta not only remained alive, but they thrived. A scientific breakthrough had occurred. And by the way, not only thrived, these things contaminated samples in the lab. So it wasn't, controlling them was a problem. They were so rapid in their division. These cells were then sent to labs throughout the United States, sometimes in the mail, like a little envelope, and the scientific community began to see endless possibility. And yet, when these same scientists opened their HeLa cell package, I kid you not, I've seen the pictures, some of them were like just your run-of-the-mill envelopes, all they saw were medical possibilities and not the person from whom these cells came. That person had a name. Her name was Henrietta Lacks. She was a black woman who died at age 31 from an aggressive form of cervical cancer, a mere 8 months after her diagnosis. And I acknowledge the fact that in the 1950s, our care for these diseases was very different from the care that we receive now, but I just want to give you that timeline. Several months prior to her death, she went to Johns Hopkins Hospital, which was one of the few hospitals at that time that provided care to the black community at that time. Given her eventual diagnosis, extra cells were taken. What Henrietta did not know was that not all of these cells went towards establishing her diagnosis. Some were sent to the lab of Dr. Gay. Dr. Gay, having isolated a specific cell from Henrietta's tumor, noticed that this singular cell could be grown in the lab indefinitely. All right, when we say immortal, when I teach this to students, they're thinking about zombies and all the things, all right? But when we say immortal, all right, we're meaning that the process of cell division, I just want to stress that again, all right, is reasonably indefinite. There is degradation over time, but it is reasonably indefinite. The cells were sent to many places. One of these places was the Tuskegee Institute, where they were grown and used to help evaluate the polio vaccine. For 24 years after her death, the family of Henrietta Lacks had no idea that her cells survived her and were responsible for many of the giant leaps forward that they were seeing. These same giant leaps forward saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and generated millions and then billions of dollars of revenue for pharmaceutical companies. All while Henrietta's family struggled to gain access to medical care or education. Again, billions of dollars of revenue, the family with no knowledge, and lacking access to basic fundamental benefits. Henrietta's family eventually learned the truth about what had become of their mother's cells when in 1973, they were asked for tissue samples. Did anyone know why they were asked for tissue samples? You what, sorry? They want to sell? Absolutely. They also had a significant problem of contamination in a lab. They couldn't figure out where the contamination came from. And so they canvassed the family. They asked for their tissue, all right, to understand what was the original cells that were working in the lab and what was the lax contaminants. Does anyone know how they randomize what the FDA does now to kind of protect people's identities when they do consent to their tissues being used for study? They're a number, right? There's a number. My cells sit in a library in the FDA. I was part of a clinical trial. I'm a number. I do not know what my number is. The researchers do not know what my number is attached to my name, right? So I come in, they give me the injection, or in our case, the infusion, all right? And all they know is, I don't know, A, B, C, D, E, active arm of the trial, positive benefit. My DNA is sequenced, it sits in a library with that number, no one associates it to Heather Foucault-Cam. HeLa, Henrietta Lacks, I mean, I don't know if that's such a good job of kind of anonymizing the donor, all right? So there's issues of privacy we'll discuss in a second. In my opinion, it is through the example of Henrietta and then her family that we are confronted with two fundamental issues. Issues which are which our Catholic schools provide very fertile ground to consider. One, that of informed consent, all right, so the legal aspect. And two, more fundamentally, that behind each and every biological sample, there is a human being with a dignity that transcends their physical biology. And the relationship of truth to race, in particular, is one that medical science has much to answer for. I think we can all agree, to use Veronica's words here, that speaking to people about Henrietta's story is an important first step. A first step that I can think of no better place to take than in the classrooms of our Catholic schools. So, to return to our outline, where we stand now is wrestling with the consideration of what is good science, right? There's a I struggle with this word, I'm going to try again. It can be repeatable. There we go. There's that piece, right? That's good science. But there's the consideration of the human good too, right? The flourishing of each person and every person everywhere. Whether it is the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks or other texts, as read in an AP Bio class or an English class, and for our colleagues who teach elementary school, I have a couple of short kind of storybooks that kind of elevate the work of Catholic figures, all right? This question here of good science and science for the human good and how they need to be linked, all right, will inevitably become if not the central concern of any kind of education. And now I would argue that the word good is thrown around, right? Chocolate cake is good. Those donuts, friends, are good. In all seriousness, we can all agree that the good we mean when we say makes science in service to the human good is something much more profound than the temporal goods I have mentioned. Cake, good behavior for our students, good football, possibly maybe this weekend from the University of Notre Dame, who knows? We know as Catholics that good, as theologically understood, has an extremely precise meaning. But before I begin unpacking that, I think it is important to consider from a legal perspective, a perspective that the majority of people may share, and a good place to take a conversation where there may be divergent opinions later. Can we describe what happened to Henrietta as legally wrong or a legal good? So in terms of like pedagogy, all right, when I talk to my students about ethics, when I taught 7th grade or in Canada, 13th grade, I mean, think about it, all right? Irrespective of where I sit in that spectrum, when I speak to my children who are in 3rd grade and 6th grade respectively, and they ask me a should I do this question, I get to that eventually, right? You all been handling those should I do this kinds of questions, right? Either as parents or as teachers. There is no point, in my opinion, to jump straight into the the ethics piece, or even as a moral theologian, the moral theology. We get up to that, right? They need to understand in an age-appropriate way, scientifically or literarily or wherever the basis of the question is, they need to understand that piece first before we get to the good science or theologically good science, theologically good literature piece. All right, so let's go to the law. We know the science. We share the law in common with our sisters and brothers in this country. Let's ask the question, was this legal? What did the law say about what happened to Henrietta as we kind of use her story as a case study for this academic integration? Provided the sample was de-identified, which hers was, all right, although not with much effort, the restrictions on what the doctors could do were few and far between at that time. So again, when Chris was talking about history, all right, this is not to say that what happened to Henrietta is okay, but effort needs to be made to understand what was going on at that time as well. What did informed consent look like? I've signed the document. Right now, it has to be written at an 8th grade level. The papers were like that thick. And there were words there like, no joke. I had my phone out and I was like, okay, that's what that means. All right? So that standard didn't even exist either. While it was written into U.S. law, informed consent in 1914, the paperwork and the kind of legal procedures for informed consent did not exist in the 50s the way they do today. What I have outlined on this slide here, all right, this is very much a modern construct. So in the past 40 or 50 years, the closest thing in Henrietta's time to what you see here, interestingly, applied only to medical procedures and not to scientific research. So I'll say that again. The closest thing they had to this applied to medical procedures, but not to scientific research. This double standard is precisely what gave the green light to a whole array of medical experiments that occurred in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, including one where unsuspecting minority patients were injected with cancer just to see how cancer behaved in a healthy body. Interestingly, all right, it was the resignation of 3 Jewish doctors who had survived the atrocities of the Second World War that brought these injustices to the knowledge of the people at the time. The doctors who perpetrated this injustice were sanctioned, but their licenses were ultimately not revoked. What the retrieval and use of Henrietta's cells and this experiment that I allude to only briefly share in common is that despite being not entirely dissonant with the ethical norms, all right, so again, the law was kind of, it was more loosey-goosey in a sense then than it is now. It was less defined is a better word. There was that restriction on medical procedure, but not actual scientific research. All right, so those were the ethical norms at the time if we treat the history for what it is as we know it. And this in no way means that this was okay. So we heard what Chris said in his lecture, and he described a few examples. We're walking through it right now, right? Does not make what happened okay, but effort needs to be taken to understand what was going on at the time. We still feel, I would argue every one of us still feels a sense of this being wrong. I was watching y'all when I mentioned that experiment, all right, that occurred in New York, where unsuspecting minority patients were injected with cancer, all right, just to see how cancer behaved. I watched y'all, all right, and there was there were shared expressions of, or going like this, all right, so we have this shared, absolutely not, right? We know that this is wrong on a human level. The nearly universal negative reaction with respect to this injustice experienced by the Lax family or by this injection of cancer into these unsuspecting minority patients is rooted in a principle that is core to the Catholic social tradition that I would argue can be taught in kindergarten through to 12th grade in the United States and 13 in Canada. That of an innate universal dignity that transcends our biology. All right, so we had the science. We looked at this consideration within the context of the historical understanding of the law. Now let us consider what our faith affords to us. And this brings us to the final piece in the Henrietta Lacks story for us, Catholic educators and administrators. That is, my friends, what does genuine or good science even mean? It cannot be just about the experimental results. To be clear, from a scientific perspective, the HeLa cell line was a breakthrough. Nor can good science be limited by concordance with the law, right? We saw that what the law was at the time. Good science is the experiment and the law and the moral norm. And this integration, which is a theme today, is of vital importance to our functioning as scientific consumers and engaged citizens. And I would argue, all right, is constituted by a sacred responsibility to pass forward to those who we encounter daily in the classroom. Students aren't necessarily formed to know that what happened to Henrietta Lacks is wrong. By examining her, we have a case study of a living, breathing human being in history that we can think through with our students at any age. And believe it or not, when we teach at this intersection of the law, of science, of the moral norms, all right, it can be a powerful tool for evangelization as well. Consider that when young people are asked why they are not Catholic, over 60% of the time, a conflict with science is presented as the reason. When this is examined further, we see crises of belief, but we also see a trend towards the church being perceived as somehow anti-progress. So a case such as Henrietta's bears a very important question. What should the human approach to science, or the study of literature, or the study of history, or the study of geography, what should that be? And in this regard, we have a strong tradition to draw on, right? On a very basic level, what we are called to do as scholars, teachers, and citizens is to do and support research that is in accordance with moral norms and is methodical. And so whenever anyone says, oh, you Catholics are totally against progress, and I love that you Catholics piece, right? It's just fabulous to be identified as you Catholics. I point them to this. We're not no progress at all, right? We ask the question, what is progress? What is true progress? And we don't separate the next discovery from the good of each person and every person everywhere without any qualification. And I own what Chris said, right? That there are real historical instances when the holiness of the church and the holiness in the church did not match. But I keep coming back to this statement as one of the very best pieces we have to chart a better future. A future where we have a thick understanding of the good. And this thick understanding of the good necessarily involves the acceptance of a relational unity between faith and reason as being key to an integral vision of the human person, both as test subject and as researcher. So what I'm going to do for a second, because we have about 10 minutes left, is I'm going to pause, and I'm going to allow you to read these, all right? It's both on the handout, all right, and on the screen, and ask for a few thoughts. Because what we're really being asked to do as citizens, and what we're really being asked to do as the faithful of the church, and as teachers, is to implore the people we encounter that there is a difference between simple choice and choosing well. So I'm going to give a moment for you to read these and ask for some thoughts, and then we'll bring this to a close. Right, friends, what do we think? Any thoughts? I agree, disagree? This makes no case for me at all. Yes, please.
Oh, do I have to do that? I'm a teacher voice.
Okay, let's hear it.
I got you.
The research offered using these cells is amazing in what it can do.
Mm-hmm.
I know I was handed HeLa cells years and years and years ago to do research on, and when I asked where they came from, I was told, "Oh, don't worry, they're just from the lab." And I said, "Yeah, but they're, you know," and we were never told where it was, but you did amazing things. And even from embryonic stem cells, what you can do, especially when you put them up in the International Space Station where gravity doesn't affect them now.
Mm-hmm.
There's that other side. You can have people just conceiving
Mm-hmm.
stems.
Mm-hmm.
There's always that dark side from money. As the scientist, you just want to do the research.
Mm-hmm.
Problems of life.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see the other side.
Right, absolutely. And I think that the beauty of the environment in which we are all operative is that we have the freedom, not always the time, I want to own that. I taught AP chemistry, and there were 180 days of curriculum, 160 of which I was scheduled, and nor'easters in Wilmington, Delaware caused me all variety of problems. So I want to own the fact that there's a timepiece. But yes, we have the freedom and ability, and I would argue the responsibility to kind of lay this open. Yes? I also want to say that where the stem cells are concerned, right? For some and many areas of biological research, that's the industry standard. And there are many complex ethical questions where we need to talk about. Some ethicists argue that that is cooperation, remote material cooperation with evil. Some would argue that it's an appropriation of evil, and they split that hair.
But how we function as people of faith in the world when it comes to scientific research, I think needs to be part of the educational project. Sir.
I think of 3 words: primacy of conscience.
There we go. Right.
And maybe that's a way of taking care of the dark side.
Yep. So there's a primacy of conscience. So it means that I'll give you an example. If you are a Catholic at an institution of higher education, you're in a biology lab, right? They're asking you to do research on embryonic stem cell lines. The primacy of conscience is, I should be protected to say, I am very sorry, I am a Catholic, all right, I cannot do this research. So there has to be that piece. I'll let you finish, and then I have a note on conscience because I want to qualify. Go ahead.
I'm in finance.
Oh, nice.
And there's the dark side, so to speak, as some people would say. Okay?
I wasn't going to say it. I wasn't going to say it, but you did it.
Because I've been involved in situations where I could actually take advantage of the law, and I don't. Because when I step in front of a classroom to tell students, I'm doing it fairly and squarely. I'm not in any way doing something that may be a little bit underhanded.
Right. No, absolutely. And I would argue that where the primacy of conscience, where that kind of unique space within the human person is considered, right? Where my ability, our human uniqueness and our ability to judge beyond just temporal good and bad. Go ahead.
One more comment about, light versus darkness, okay?
Go ahead.
I went blind for more than 2 years, okay? So as a result, I can tell you when it's perfectly, brilliantly light, I can't see it. When it's very dark, I can't see it. It's only through the blend of the light and the darkness that I can see.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. Thank you. To go back to the comment that both of you were getting at on the primacy of conscience, what I would add to that in terms of something that we can all kind of share as educators is that, yes, our conscience rights have been upheld for the church, upheld by the church as long as the church has been in existence. But there's an obligation to form one's conscience as well, right? So yes, there are conscience rights, but we also have this obligation to form the conscience. And so by taking a look at these historical instances, right, as they are integrated into our curricula, we take that step to form the consciences of our students very seriously. And to do that, all right, this was a perfect segue, and these comments were not planted in any way. To do that, all right, involves the kind of awareness of the gifts that the other disciplines bring, right? George Lemaitre, anyone know who he is? Go ahead, Pete. Who is he? What did he gift the world with that we would never attribute to a Catholic scientist? Maybe. I mean, I would, but some people are like, what?
Well, I mean...
His major scientific discovery.
Okay, so, I mean, I'm assuming most of you know about the Big Bang here, but, you know about the conflict. That can't be scientific. And when I put up the poster from World on Fire, the immediate question was, why do we have him on the wall in a Catholic school?
I know.
I had to do a talk to my teachers as to why.
Right.
Yes.
He gave us the Big Bang Theory. Right? Einstein did not fully understand the implications of his mathematics. All right? It was a Catholic priest who put the pieces together. And he famously said this: I realized that there were 2 paths to the truth. Not 2 paths, 2 truths. 2 paths, 1 truth. I followed both. So when we think about the formation of conscience, when we think about what that looks like practically within the context of Henrietta Lacks, all right, to look at it from only one perspective is to not do due diligence to the issue at hand. It is a consideration of science. Yes, we know what cells are. I had to remind myself before I came here what a cell is, because chemists deal with the little atom things, right? It is a consideration of the law. It is a consideration of finance, all right? It is a consideration of civics and psychology and literature. And so when we saw today, as we opened our time together with Chris, that a Catholic school, irrespective of whether it is elementary, high school, a university institution, has to be about
the integration of the subjects taught in the light of the gospel, not subsuming them into each other, putting the pieces back together. I can think of no greater example than Henrietta Lacks for kind of modeling how that could possibly work. And so because I could see Patrick standing very politely to tell me to be quiet. Oh, we good on time? Brilliant. I have my watch too, and I'm always set it like a minute fast for precisely this reason. And so what I would like to do to bring this to a close, to kind of give us an opportunity for comments, affirmations, or not, as it were, what I would like to do is close with these words of Sister Thea Bowman. And I turn to her address to the U.S. Bishops' Conference in 1989. She was the first African-American woman to address the conference. Sister Thea was declared a servant of God in 2018, and her cause for canonization was opened in 2019. During her life, she endured racism and inequality, but fought tirelessly for the education you all practice each day. Sister Thea's refusal to accept the injustices in her church and her community is a model for what all of us are called to. It is to these holy words that we conclude. And this is the only time I'm going to read off my slides. Today, we are called to walk together in a new way toward that land of promise and to celebrate who we are and whose we are not. The church teaches us that she is a family of families, and the family has to stay together, and we know that if we do stay together, if we walk and talk and work and play and stand together in Jesus' name, we'll be who we say we are, truly Catholic, and we shall overcome. We shall overcome the poverty, overcome the loneliness, overcome the alienation, and build together a holy city, a new Jerusalem, a city set apart where they'll know that we are here because we love one another. And my friends, I can think of no better place to model this than the Catholic schools that we all live and work and teach in every day. I am hopeful that the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks has planted seeds in your minds for how you can work together to achieve that integration in your schools. And with that, I'm going to close, and I think we have room for one question. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heather.
I'm black.
Okay.
My biggest fear is that in the classroom, in these discussions, there may be a child who is a recipient of chemotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
Could be a child who is here because of IVF.
Oh, yep.
You know, how do you do it?
That is a wonderful question. I'll have a first pass, but seeing as all of you are professionals in this, or practitioners and professionals in this space and ministers in this space, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Again, I was on a clinical trial, and the first stage in that trial is the testing on human cell lines. It was the HeLa cell lines. My son is alive because of that clinical trial, so there's that piece. So you mentioned the cell lines and the IVF. Practically speaking, I taught bioethics at a Catholic school. I talked about it, right? So I said, friends, we're going to talk about IVF today. I sent a letter home to the parents just warning them, right? And I do this approach, right? The science, the law, the theology, right? That's how I did it. I kid you not. I say, all right, friends, we're going to talk about IVF today. And before I could get to the piece about everyone being loved and everyone being God's own beloved, a child sat right where you are, ma'am, relative to me, put her hand up and said, I was conceived by IVF. Why does the church hate me? So I want to own the fact that having these discussions does bring that, right? Absolutely. And for me, practically speaking, there is a bit of stress involved. Like, let's just own the human element of this, right? You're like, oh, I'm going to be talking about that. But it's also an important investment in who we are as educators. So practically speaking, what was my response to that child? I looked right at her and I said, "You're God's own beloved." Just like each and every one of you here. And I looked at them and I made eye contact, are God's own beloved. We're going to talk about this scientifically. We are going to consider what is within the domain of the law. And we're going to provide the church's teaching on this particular technique. But it does not take away that you are God's own beloved without exception. 2, practically speaking, in terms of a teaching strategy, when I do have these conversations as part of, because, class participation or engagement is something we have to be aware of as well. Like, how do you say you have to participate in the IVF lesson or you have to participate in this discussion? Not everyone's comfortable. Believe it or not, I'm also shy by nature, all right? So I'm not comfortable either. I allowed them to journal. I actually insisted on it. So their homework for some of these, let's say more, these conversations that could have the potential to kind of hit home internally for these students a bit more than others, right? As a chemist, we talk about the periodic table. No one's going to freak out about the periodic table, right? But some of these questions carry some very personal experience, and I think that needs to be owned. My son is alive, right? He is alive and thriving because of a clinical trial. How do I own the safety of those cells, like my part in this story, right? So I feel that journaling also helps the students kind of articulate their opinions. Now, this very same student who is now married and has a child of her own, because we talk on Facebook, about 2 years after the class sent me an email and said, "Hey, I saw this online. Do you know about 3-person IVF?" So because we minister to our students in the way that we do, right, with an effort towards education within the context of a relationship, that child was still thinking about the IVF lesson 2 years later and sought me out to kind of talk through 3-person IVF, right, herself an IVF child. So that's part of this, right? Again, I bring it back to love. And we did a priestly formation event at Notre Dame, and when the priest asked, "How do you handle this?" This is, again, there are a lot of other issues that also need to be addressed, but I start with love when I am, and I have found that worked for me. Anybody else have any suggestions? Ma'am.
What happened to me is when I taught biology, I said, "You can do biology of anything you want." And this boy said, "I want to do IVF." And I said, "Well, you do have to at the end talk about how it's against the church's teachings." And he said, he was one of triplets. And
Oh, wow.
I was deceived by that. And I was my first year at Don Bosco, I started crying and I went to the priest and he's like, "You did the right thing." And I went back and I said, "You're loved, just like you did.
Boom.
You're loved." And he didn't want to do it anymore, but we're still friends.
Brilliant.
I'm friends with the whole family. So.
Beautiful. And I think also in terms, and again, I want to pick up on if I can, that last piece of what you said, right? To the extent that we can alert or even partner with parents, especially on these things, that tends to help. After I did this lesson, we did a series of bioethics lessons. I then co-taught a lesson with our parish priests together, right? So we spoke using different voices, but from the one truth that undergirds all that we do. And that was helpful for the students as well, right? What I didn't know was our parish priest was actually adopted. And when the students were asking about IVF, and they said, "Well, Mrs. Cam told us this, and this, and we get it, but like, what do you think?" And they're trying to figure out, which one of us is telling them the truth, right? Father Nick, God rest him, said, "Well, I'm adopted." And so because someone looked to people like me, I had a family, I knew love, and I had education. And that speaks to also the importance of witnesses as well, right? So that it's not just me doing A, B, C, D, E for my students. There are other people, other touch points within the community, right? We had Catholic doctors come in and talk to the students, the parish priests, some of the parents. There are other people within the community that are also speaking from this perspective. It's helpful for the students to see that as well. Ma'am.
I had students at
What did you say? Right. Okay. Right. Right. So, and that's a wonderful, because, oh goodness, seventh grade? Wow. Right? Our daughters asked us similar questions like this, and I'm like, where can I even start? Right? Because, I mean, for our kindergarten to eighth grade colleagues, God bless the work that you do. They hear these questions in the world, right? And they're operating from such a position of innocence, and they don't have necessarily, they're not at the right time to have the full understanding of, why they have that question. What questions like that, were those people bad Catholics, if any of them were Catholic? That's a wonderful opportunity for us to have a conversation of can, should, right? Can this be done? Yes. Should this have been done? No, right? And depending on where these students are in their moral development, that conversation can then take on various levels of specificity, right? I use analogies with our kids who are in 3rd and 6th grade, but when I talked about IVF with our students, and they wanted to know why the church has the position that she does, all right? I talked to them about, where do you see the nose here? So dignitas personae, evangelium vitae, the lot. Where do you see the nose? And they're like, okay, no. And I say, okay, fair enough, not denying that. Where is the larger yes? What are we saying yes to here, right? We're saying the yes to the dignity of human life. It is not my position to judge people as good or bad. That's our Lord's position. But what I would hold where IVF is concerned is that the church says a great yes to the dignity of human life, right? From conception until natural death. All right? And so that is the great yes behind what we see as a prohibition. There's an affirmation behind it, right? And that is the dignity of each person and every person everywhere without exception. So when I'm asked about good Catholics or bad Catholics, thank goodness, I just tell them, like, friends, I don't judge. That's God's job. But here's, you know what I mean? Yeah, that's God's job. However, what I can present to you is, here's the science in an age-appropriate way, and here is the moral norm. And the moral norm is this way because of this reason, this reason, this reason. This prohibition is an affirmation of how loved each and every one of us are.
So I see that there are more questions. Unfortunately, we don't have to cut it off. We are going to just kind of keep rolling into a wider discussion, but I do want to take the opportunity to thank Heather again for her presentation. All right, so while the last few people are refilling coffee or doing whatever else, that's fine. But I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So you've already heard from her a bit, but Beth Lapsey is Program Director for the Fiat Program on Faith and Mental Health, also at the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame. She leads the Institute's efforts to generate pastoral research, education, and formation opportunities on mental health and the Catholic tradition. A mental health counselor by training, Beth has provided therapeutic care for adolescents and adults with histories of trauma and adverse child experiences. Her therapeutic approach is integrative, attending to neurodevelopmental influences and the intersection of spirituality and psychology. Beth obtained her master's in clinical mental health counseling from Divine Mercy University. She graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a BA in theology and peace studies, and later pursued postgrad studies at the University of Oxford in Christian ethics. If there were any doubt of Beth's commitment to the people that she serves, I would just point out that she left her native, beautiful Wyoming to pursue this work in South Bend, Indiana. So clearly she's a woman of passion and faith and commitment, and we're grateful to you for being with us today.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much, Pat. It really is a profound joy to be with this community today. And I thank God for each of you and for your vocations as educators. Thank you for your work. I hope that what I have the chance to share in the next 45 minutes is helpful and is a service to you all. I know I'm still digesting that wonderful grilled cheese with brie cheese. That was such a game changer. I've never had grilled cheese with brie cheese. There's no going back now. So today I'm grateful we have the chance to think about mental health. And I'd like to invite us as we begin to pause. Because when we have conversations around mental health, they're not just theoretical conversations, right? So often to talk about mental health means that particular students come to mind, particular experiences of our students, perhaps personally within our families, come to mind. So let's just take a pulse check as we start and hold this question quietly. So when we ask the question of what is mental health, what do you notice? And when you're thinking, how would I answer what is mental health? What begins to come up for you in the realm of feelings, emotions? And we're embodied souls, so often our emotions come up first through the body, and are presented through physiological symptoms. So let's just pause and breathe. Notice kind of what comes forward for us. Now let's think for a moment how the students in your life would respond to the question of what is mental health. Maybe not so much with a conceptual answer, but through their experiences. What would the question bring up for them when they're thinking about mental health in the realm of experience and emotion? All right. Rather than take the time right now for small group discussion, I ask these questions at the outset so as to invite us to cultivate a certain level of embodied awareness throughout our time together today. So I invite you just to notice as I continue with this talk and then as we enter into discussion together, to practice some of that awareness and perhaps jot some things down so that you can bring it to further reflection and prayer. So our aims for today are first and foremost to reclaim a more integrated understanding of mental health. Integration has been a key aim for us today. We're going to practically apply that through seeking and inquiring about mental health. And then second is just very practical. What does this mean in our day-to-day lives as educators, as those who are working with students who may be experiencing mental distress and mental illness? And as Patrick named, I have the joy of being based with colleagues Chris and Heather at the University of Notre Dame in a place called the McGrath Institute for Church Life. And at the McGrath Institute, we have a program called the FIAT Program on Faith and Mental Health. And our mission with FIAT is to provide formation and support to those who are actively working in the field, those working in our Catholic schools as well as parishes and dioceses, to promote a more integrated understanding of mental health, and then to support us in those concrete practices and habits of accompaniment to better care for those experiencing mental distress and mental illness. I like to begin our conversation around mental health just with taking stock of where we are and how often we as a people might experience mental health and mental illness. So perhaps if you've had mental illness within your family or within your life personally, or if you've walked closely with another, you're well aware of how that experience can contribute to a sense of not being able to see clearly. Right? Mental illness affects our interiority, our self-understanding, our perception of self and the others. And when we're walking closely with another, we too can feel kind of some of that burden of mental illness. Unfortunately, nowadays, I think a great good is that with increased awareness about mental health, there's much more information out there today. But something about much of the information that we see that's coming forth on social media or via other mainstream outlets that's talking about mental health, it's actually not espousing an integrated view of the person. And so it only gets us so far when we're trying to emerge from the cave, so to speak, and to understand mental health and mental illness. And so part of our aim is, as we named, to draw from the resources of faith and science so that we can arrive at this more integrated vision of the human person when it comes to mental health and mental illness. But let's consider what we're living through. So we are living through what has been described as a mental health crisis. In 2021, the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued an advisory on the crisis of youth mental health. Certainly we can think about maybe factors that could contribute to this. This was coming in the aftermath of COVID, but we saw youth mental health concerns on the rise before COVID. About a decade before COVID, we really saw heightened increase. And so these numbers here are charting increases in self-reported depression among teenagers. We find increases across the board among other mental health conditions. First and foremost would be depression and anxiety. Just a bit of a breakdown when we're looking kind of across the numbers and age groups. Certainly we see higher incidences of reported anxiety, depression, and then behavioral disorders. This would include attention deficit hyperactivity, among others. Unfortunately, we've also seen rises in self-harm. This is more marked among girls, but then we see higher rates of suicide attempts among boys. And just a moment, whenever we're holding statistics, right, a statistic is not just a stat, it's not just a number. And so we approach this with reverence, because I know within your schools that you know and perhaps have lost students. And so just we bring them to prayer as we continue in our time together today. So, what contributes to what we're witnessing, these heightened rates of mental distress and mental illness among both our children and our teenagers? Well, this is a faith and science seminar, and so we can recognize through the wisdom of science that we are ecological creatures. A dear friend of mine who I mentioned, who I teach with these seminars on faith and mental health, she directs our neuroscience undergrad major at the university. And she said, we're ecological creatures, which is to say we are embedded with our environments. We're profoundly impacted by our environment and our experience. So what is the environment that we're all living through? Not just that we're all living in, not just our students. So you know this better than I, right? You're in the schools day to day, but we see 95% of teens have access to a smartphone, and around 50, close to 50%, report being online almost constantly. Anyone familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt? He came out with the book Anxious Generation this past year. I think Haidt offers a really great analysis of what we're seeing among our young people. And he talks about various factors that are contributing to the rise in mental illness and mental distress among our children and teens. He's very critical of the heightened, just omnipresent expression of technology, of phone use among our kids and teens, and he describes the replacement of the play-based childhood with the phone-based childhood. In a few moments, we're going to talk about the impact that really has when we think about a young person's socio-emotional development and their need for rich, interactive experiences as a part of their development. But when we just think about it in terms of engagement with social media. So we see heightened rates of phone usage, time with technology among our young people. And so what are they not spending time with then? Well, I find it really startling when we look at just daily time interacting with friends. This would be in-person, three-dimensional interaction. That it's down to under 60 minutes a day. So I might be online almost constantly. But in terms of those rich interactive times with others, how reduced that is. Just to point out a few other factors that have been reported when we're looking at our young people today. So certainly there's this increase in connectedness digitally, but we find a profound increase also in reported rates of loneliness and isolation. We've heard reports that Gen Z, so the 12 to 27 age range, is the loneliest generation. What else are we seeing? So we're seeing a collapse in one's sense of self, in one's experience of personhood into singular dimensions. This could be collapsing into one's mental health experience, or it could be collapsing one's identity into another dimension of self. And finally, just this loss of childhood, right? The replacement of a play-based childhood with a phone-based childhood. But it's the loss of childhood in general, of some of the freedoms that we might associate with childhood. So if we were to just kind of turn over a further leaf in seeking to understand better this crisis of mental health among our youth in a way that then lends us practically into what can we do as educators and as parents, how might we do so by more fully drawing upon faith and science together? So that's where we'll turn now. So, as Chris was mentioning at the outset, our faith tradition has long held the big questions. Mental health is a unique space which calls to mind the big questions. So doing, it necessitates our engagement of the sciences, but at once it brings us up against the limitations of science to answer these questions ultimately. And so nowadays, I don't think it's that common for a young person to ask, why do I suffer? They might ask, why does a good God allow suffering? But how often do we instead hear someone name, gosh, why am I so anxious? You know, I can't focus. What's wrong with me? Or hear a parent say, my child won't get out of bed. I don't understand. I don't understand what is going on. That these are questions of suffering. So how do we hold these questions around both suffering and healing? So drawing some from neuroscience, if we were to engage neuroscience to explain how mental illness develops, what insights can we glean here? Well, we recognize that mental illness develops from a coming together of factors. This is probably review for many of you, right? You're educators in science. But illness is the result of a coming together of factors which are genetic, so inherited, which are biological, unique to my own biology, which are environmental. And so environmental, we know that this is sociocultural, kind of the waters that we're swimming in, as well as developmental. And epigenetics plays a key role in the development of mental illness. Whenever I'm seeking to explain epigenetics to a lay audience, I say, if we were to try to understand epigenetics, it's that through our genes we inherit a certain vulnerability to mental illness, but whether or not that gene gets turned on, so to speak, gets expressed, well, that is the result of environmental and developmental factors. You can correct me if I'm wrong in terms of offering a layman's understanding of epigenetics. But so what do we come to realize here? That environment and development can play a key role, and that specifically stress is that mediating factor, that when environment and developmental factors place stress upon our person, that can then contribute to the expression of mental illness. So if we were to unpack this just a bit further, since we are a group who is not afraid of the sciences, as we're seeking to understand why stress bears that impact upon our person so as to contribute to our vulnerability to mental illness, well, we understand first and foremost that the nervous system plays such a central role in our development across the lifespan, right? It's the principal regulatory communication system in our body. And neuroception also plays a key role. So often when I'm talking with folks, I say, we're pretty aware of cognitive perception. Cognitive perception, I'm thinking about, I'm aware, I can notice a few yawns, I can notice the energy level here. I'm thinking about it, I'm cognitively aware of it. But neuroception registers my experience of the room milliseconds before I'm actually thinking about it. So through neuroception, I can be sitting next to someone and just notice, like, wow, I feel pretty calm around this person. I feel like comfortable, like this is a trusting person. Or if I'm around someone else, I might like, I feel kind of uncomfortable right now. I wonder why, right? Well, we pick up through neuroception on another person's level of stress or of calm. This is fascinating. We think about an infant and child, right? An infant is co-regulating with the mother. But we don't lose this faculty across our lifespan. We're always co-regulating with one another. In my professional life, I've also had the joy of working as a therapist. Part of what we do in our therapeutic training is just focus on calming ourselves down so that we don't become dysregulated and stressed by the stress of someone in our office. Because if I calm myself down, the person who's come into my office for therapy is going to be better able to co-regulate with me. All right? It's going to be pretty tough when we just think about classroom dynamics, all that we've lived through in the past 4 years, pretty high elevated levels of stress that we're all just ingesting, but maybe not actually thinking through it. All right. One other element here, which I think is worthwhile to just point out as we're seeking to understand the why. Why would stress have such an impact on us? Well, as people, memory is really important to us. And we don't just experience memory in terms of narrative memory. So I could describe what I had for breakfast yesterday or a Christmas memory. But we also experience memory that is implicit. So it's felt, it has emotion with it, but I can't necessarily describe it. So this is how our person stores that data of neuroceptive experience. So for instance, when I say to a child or a student in school, so tell me about your family. It could be a child who experiences some instability in home life, and maybe they have trouble putting it into words, but that implicit memory contributes to a sense of, it's hard to talk about family, right? Versus maybe a kiddo where there is a lot of stability at home life. And so they can say, oh, well, mom and dad, they have a different experience, and it's reflected through that implicit memory, okay? Diathesis stress model is just another way of talking about, of putting into terms this interaction between environment and development with our genetic vulnerabilities that can contribute to the expression of mental health symptoms. Just a few other kind of key things to keep in mind as we're thinking about adolescence. I know we have educators here both at the elementary and the high school level. Traditionally, we saw more mental illness emerge in adolescence. So this isn't a new phenomenon that we would see mental illness develop in adolescence. But as we're seeking to understand, even over history, we've seen that mental illness would emerge at that developmental stage. So it's a time of just profound reorganization within the brain. So when we're thinking about kind of the neural synapses, there's a lot of pruning that's going on, a lot of change. It's a time where, of course, there's increased attunement to peer influence. I was talking to some educators, and they were saying, yeah, suddenly they become freshmen, and they don't want to pay attention to their teachers. They don't value your authority in the same way, right? We're valuing peer authority. And I think we all know there's an increased weighting of the dopamine system, meaning my sense of threat goes way down and I'm looking for the thrill. So it is a unique period of vulnerability. One other consideration for us as we're thinking about all of this is that stress does not only result from negative things happening to me, from environmental and developmental factors that would present stress upon my person, but we can also experience threat due to unmet needs. And so this dear friend of mine who's the neuroscientist, she says, Beth, we could really summarize some of our most fundamental neurobiological needs, so needs of the nervous system for our socio-emotional development across the lifespan, in these 4 areas. We have a need for secure, stable relationships. In our earliest years, we would describe that as the attachment relationship with parent-child. But we have a need for that security of relationship across our lifetime, where we can know and be known, where we can experience healthy vulnerability. We have a need for time and creation, right? Time outdoors, being in nature. We have a need to move, which a lot of us don't get. I know you're standing in your classrooms most of the time, but boy, the average American adult is sitting at a desk a lot of the day. Even our kiddos, right? We can see their need to move after they've been sitting down for a long time. And then we have a need for silence. We recognize that there have been various studies done lately about the correlation between time spent in prayer and different liturgical practices and positive mental health. This doesn't mean the absence of mental illness. This means one's ability to cope even in the experience of mental illness. So positive mental health outcomes correlating with experiences of silence and experiences of prayer. I like to note here, though, as people of faith, we should be cautious not to reduce prayer and faith to a utility, to a good because it serves mental health outcomes. Rather, we recognize prayer is communion with God. And so how beautiful that we're seeing indeed that there are positive outcomes, though it's not reducible to that. So in summary, I think if we have one key takeaway, right? Mental illness, it's not a personal fault, and it's not just the fault of one's family. It comes together because of this complexity of factors: environmental, genetic, developmental, and biological. So if we continue to hold this question of why do I suffer, why does mental illness exist, through the lens of our faith, kind of what resources does our faith tradition have to offer? I appreciate this statement that the California Conference of Catholic Bishops came out with in 2018. They point out a few things here. One, they take us back to the very beginning, the story of Genesis, talking about the fall. And so we can understand that with the fall, there came about original sin. But we can also see that there came about this original woundedness, so to speak, this fracturing, this fragmenting of our being as created in, through, and for relationship. It opens us up to the possibility for illness in this life and the possibility of hurting and being hurt by others. And then they note that certainly we don't want to trivialize experiences of mental illness, but as a people of faith, as sinners, as individuals who are vulnerable to illness, we also need to overcome an us versus them mentality and recognize that we all have a profound vulnerability as a people. And then they invite us to consider how we can better accompany one another in light of a recognition of our vulnerability. So let's break this down a moment further. If we take a basic theological anthropology, we can recognize, drawing from the richness of our faith tradition, that we are created good, fallen, redeemed, and sanctified. So to be created good means that we're created in the image and likeness of God. But who is God, right? I think sometimes it's interesting to ask our students, what is their operative image of God? And if it's just a white-bearded celestial figure, then it seems pretty weird to think I'm created in his image and likeness. But if indeed we recognize that God is love, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, existing in this dynamic of love, of perfect relationship and dynamic relationality, then to be created in the image and likeness of God means that I'm relational at my core, that I actually just can't understand myself as an individual who is meant to live an autonomous life. Rather, it means that I'm created in, through, and for relationship. So I often will invite students, how do we then begin to reconceptualize of mental health through an understanding that we are created in, through, and for relationship, that we can't just understand mental health through an individualistic lens. But we know we're not just created good, right? That we do experience the consequences of the fall. And so like the California Conference of Bishops was inviting us to reflect on, that with the fall there came about this fracturing and fragmenting of our being and relationship, including our relationship with our own person as this integral unity of body, soul. So as a result, we can experience day to day that our mind would feel at odds from our values, that our embodied response of anxiety or whatever it might be might feel at odds with what we believe. Right? This inner tension that we experience is part of the human condition, expressed and experienced differently according to each of us in our individuality, but reflective of that original woundedness. But as people of faith, we recognize that the fall, it's not the end of the story. So to be redeemed means that we're experiencing this salvific grace of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. That God, by becoming the person of Christ and taking on our suffering to the point of death, means that no suffering is beyond love. It means that even when we feel profound desolation, darkness, and isolation, perhaps from mental illness or another cause, God is still there, suffering with us. The presence of love and mercy is there. And I think this is something, that we as a people of faith, we're called to embody. This is present in our sacramental life, God present with us. But Pope Benedict XVI, when speaking on the Eucharist, he said, a Eucharist that doesn't pass out into concrete practices of love, it's intrinsically fragmented, right? So in our care for one another, we're meant to imitate that divine movement of being present to one another amidst the darkness of suffering. And finally, just to close out the loop on this theological anthropology, we're sanctified. What does sanctified mean? It means that we're called into this divine life of communion in the here and now, such that suffering is not the end of the story. I think there's so much to be plumbed there, but we'll pause now in the interest of time. So in summary, mental illness, it's not the result of not praying enough. It's not the result of a lack of faith. It's not a punishment for personal sin. Rather, mental illness reflects our universal vulnerability as a people. And this universal vulnerability is expressed differently for each one of us. So let's take some more practical steps. What does this mean for each of us in our daily lives as parents, perhaps as spouses, and as educators and administrators? So, if we think about the fact that we're ecological creatures, Our environment and our experiences, they impact us. Let's just take stock for a moment. So, among your students, to what extent are these basic needs for secure, stable relationship, for time outside, for movement, and for silence and prayer, to what extent are those basic needs met in your student's life? We'll return to this a bit later, so no need to discuss right now. And then perhaps it's even harder to take an inward turn, say, in our own lives, to what extent are these basic needs met? And if we notice that some needs are unmet, or just not met very fully, that we don't get a lot of silence in our life, what do we notice is interfering with meeting these basic needs? And a final question would be, how, if at all, does recognizing certain unmet basic needs impact how we think about mental health and mental illness? So how can we promote hope, belonging, and well-being in our families and schools? I think belonging is really key. When we go back to the role of relationship and see this rising incidence of isolation and loneliness experienced among our young people, that's an important correlation to attend to, the rising rates of mental illness and then the rising rates of loneliness among young people. And we're created for connection. So I think maybe a myth that might be present among some of our young people, perhaps not though, is that virtual connection, that it's enough, right? That's what everybody's doing, that we're all connecting in that way. I gotta keep up with everybody else, so I'm just gonna keep doing this, to have one's phone privileges limited in any way would mean that one risks becoming profoundly disconnected. But in reality, what we find, the beauty of the brain, body, the mind, is that actually we are created for three-dimensional sensory interpersonal experiences. From our youngest years, we need these rich sensory experiences for our brain development and for our socio-emotional development. And so actually two-dimensional connection, virtual connection, it just doesn't cut it on the whole. We experience something that could be described as a synaptic depression when our expectation for rich three-dimensional sensory experience is not sufficiently met. And this is something just to unpack a bit further when we're thinking about our day-to-day lives. The beauty of interpersonal connection is that when we have secure, supportive relationship, when we neuroceptively can experience like, oh, I'm cared about by this person, I can co-regulate here, that these relationships actually buffer stress, that they serve as a key protective factor. And because our nervous system is co-regulatory across our lifespan, there's a powerful potential for relationships to help us mitigate some of the negative impact of environmental and developmental stressors. We find that with consistent caring relationships, we experience a release of the neurotransmitter and hormone oxytocin, right? Sometimes we call that the cuddle hormone, but that's released just in supportive relationship with one another. It can be present in your classrooms and mentoring relationships, and it helps us regulate the stress response while promoting various anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. I find hope in this. It's simple, but not easy. So how might we cultivate practices for connection, or in other words, practices of integration within our daily lives? Just a few ideas here for us to think through. In order to connect, I do think we have to disconnect because we are so profoundly disconnected. And so to what extent do our classroom learning and our extracurricular activities prioritize opportunities for small group discussion? Peach, I loved hearing from you that there's a conversation class that you undertake. And so many young people, they say they experience a lot of social discomfort, social anxiety when they are face to face with another person. And so sometimes they'll say, I don't get it. You told me that when I'm person to person with another, that should produce oxytocin and I should feel better, but I just feel more anxious. So what do we do about that? Well, we need to provide a supportive enough scaffolding such that these young people who haven't had the chance to learn how to interact, how to have casual conversation, can learn how to do so. So it can be as simple as like, let's integrate some conversation starters when we do time for small group discussion. There's some powerful data out there about how when in conversation, we're invited to reflect on positive things, that it contributes to extra dopamine stimulation, so we feel better. So what might that look like? So inviting students to reflect on what contributes to thriving, Do we have moments to share what we're grateful for? Do we have moments to talk about positive life experiences? Not in a way that contributes to toxic positivity, but that just helps us focus on some of the good, some of what keeps us going. And then at once, do we also have spaces where we can talk about what is hard? How are we creating space for healthy vulnerability within the classroom and the extracurricular spaces? Friends, you all know this, but mentoring, coaching relationships, these are key. Let's pause just for a moment. Who is a mentor in your life, past or present? And let's just think about some of their qualities. I was talking with a gal yesterday, and she said, sometimes I just wish I could look back at my life as a scrapbook and see just like those pages on the scrapbook, each quality in me that I've learned and developed in relation to a mentor. So let's just pause for one moment, turn to your neighbor, and share something about a mentor in your life. Could be something you admired in them, something you learned from them. We'll just take 1 minute. If there's not a clear neighbor, then be in a group of 3. Friends, I'm going to call everybody back, but thanks for taking a moment just to pause and to reflect. Beautiful to hear some different things coming forth. So, what are some other ways that we cultivate connection? There's one high school in, it's in Kansas City, and there's a remarkable culture of belonging among the students there. And I was speaking with one young man who's a senior, and I said, what about it contributes to this experience of belonging? You are an anomaly among many of our schools. And he said, well, one thing that we do is there's an opportunity for our staff, our teachers, and students to give witness. And so during different assemblies, they'll invite someone to give witness to an experience of hardship in their life and how they navigated through it and what gives them hope. And I've been reflecting on that because I think sometimes we feel so much pressure and a need to cultivate a spirit of excellence within our schools, but then we can overshadow or undermine opportunities for healthy vulnerability, where we share more of the full story. And Chris was talking about good Catholic literature earlier, right? Literature helps us to see the story and then hopefully to behold one another's stories. I think there's the deeper invitation there. So how might we do that within our schools? And finally, that the invitation to grow in connection with one another is also an invitation to grow in connection with God, and that we can see the two in relationship. When I began this work with the Fiat program, I noticed that we use the language of healing a lot as people, but that we can have different expectations for what that means and what that looks like, and we don't always talk about it. And so I began to ask the question of what is healing? Truly, what do we mean by healing within the Catholic tradition? And there are varied understandings, but a common denominator is this, that healing can include cure, but is not limited to it, right? Even in the Gospels where you see instances of healing, these individuals still suffer death and decay. But healing always involves a movement toward restored communion. So when we think about the effects of original sin, the fracturing, the fragmenting of our relationship with God, one another, creation, and within ourselves, healing is a movement toward restored communion with God, one another, creation, and within oneself, moving us toward deeper integrity, toward a whole. I know I'm coming up on my time here, so I'm just going to quickly review a few other areas. You all have received handouts on the desk, and one is creating school cultures of care, and the second is about resources and referrals when we are encountering a student in mental distress. So the school cultures of care invites us to take an inventory of just where we are in our school, and to use integration as a barometer for how we're doing and how we might move toward deepening integration. In our remarks thus far, we've simplified that inventory, so to speak, and rather than utilizing all those categories, we've been looking at how can we foster deepening integration through these 4 areas. Deepening connection with each other in terms of deepening secure, stable relationship, cultivating opportunities for silence, cultivating opportunities for movement, and then cultivating opportunities for being in creation. I think silence is key and is so difficult nowadays. I'm a firm advocate of no phone policies within the schools. If you're interested in reading more about that, I think Jonathan Haidt's work is excellent. But when we think about cultivating silence in our families and schools, I often think of the adage, don't imagine a pink elephant. What do we immediately think of? A pink elephant, right? When I'm working with someone one-to-one in the therapeutic setting, if they have a goal to reduce a problematic behavior in their life or overcome some compulsion, something that's more addictive in nature, if all they do all day is focus on, gosh, I just really want that next cigarette, it's going to be really hard not to have that next cigarette, right? We need to refocus on something else. So if I'm just thinking about how much I'd like to be on my phone on social media at 3 a.m., which I don't, but we know this is a reality, then it's going to be really hard not to do that, right? There's so many addictive properties of the phone and the whole culture. So if we're not thinking about that, then what are we focusing on? And this, I think, is an invitation that we can support families and parents in, but that we can also cultivate in the school. And so when we're thinking about disconnecting, we disconnect in order to connect. So in what ways within our schools, within our classrooms, do we have a chance to reconnect with creation, with beauty, with the transcendentals, with the arts, in a way that evokes wonder and awe? To what extent are independent learning, our exploration encouraged such that someone can come up with the questions that they have and pursue answers? We were talking about science fair projects earlier. I think that's such a wonderful means of that. And then free play and creative movement are key. I'm going to speak about this just in terms of practical steps that we can take. Free play and movement are also important in our lives. So we have an opportunity to be a co-regulatory presence for our students, for our spouses, for our family members, but it's not easy. I'm a very sensitive person. I pick up on other people's levels of stress, and if I'm not aware of it, by the time I get through the end of the day, my shoulders are tight, I'm tense, my heart is just racing. So how do we slow down, right? Well, we've learned a few things. So one, certainly for us to connect with others, for us to have relationships in our life where we can know and be known is key. How, though, can we also cultivate silence within our days? I heard from a friend recently. She said, boy, this is a friend whose son, he's in his 40s, he has schizophrenia and also addiction. Her life is hard caring for him. She said, I stop during the day and I breathe and I stretch. She said, those are ways I put myself back together again. I said, wow, okay. Thank you for sharing, for modeling for me. Do we get time outdoors? Do we get time to move? We've learned that beginning with embodied strategies actually helps us to calm our stress response and to foster new ways of responding. Breath is key to helping regulate our stress response. If we take shorter breaths in and deeper breaths out, it helps calm the nervous system. Bilateral movement, right-left movement, also helps regulate the nervous system. So going for a walk, it's a 2-for-1. We get out in creation and we get the bilateral. Heather knows this about me, like I will tap. If I'm in a tense meeting at work, I am tapping my feet and breathing to get through it. I try not to do that if I'm in a really tense conversation with my husband, because he might then take it the wrong way, because he knows that about me. Singing, humming, the use of vocal cords calms us down. As a therapist, when I leave the office, so often the first thing I do is worry. And then I worry about my clients all the way home. And I had to stop doing that. It was just destroying me. So what do? I sing in the car. Thankfully, it's in the car, so other people don't have to be subject to it. And then I have learned that I need to express gratitude and see the gifts in my clients, because my worrying was making my vision shrink. So all I was seeing was the struggle. And so in the car rides home, I say, God, I thank you for so-and-so, and I name their gifts out loud. And sometimes it's really hard for me to think about what their gifts are. But right, every person has gifts. How might we do that for our students so that we can better reflect the fullness of their person back to them? And then liturgy and the sacramental life, as I named, we have these correlative studies. Breathe, we're almost through. So friends, as we just conclude today, I want to give a few final remarks. No man is an island, it takes a village. So how can we have conversations with others in our school? What does it look like for us to respond as a community? One, proactively to build a culture of care, but then secondly, when a student is in crisis and is in distress. We're going to transition to some time for small group discussion, and you'll have the chance to refer to the second handout, which is about resources and referrals. That second handout walks us through 3 generalized categories, which I've said levels of distress that a young person may be experiencing. Signs for that level of distress, and then steps we could take to better support them. The first level is experiencing some downs in life, but still having well-being, still being able to move through it. The second level would be there's distress present for this kiddo, and they need some additional support. And then the third level would be a kiddo's in crisis, and so we need to get some immediate support. I hope that handout is something that you could take back to others in your school and have a conversation. What is our approach across departments, among teachers, administration, within our guidance offices? How do we think about cultivating an ecosystem of care, but then also responding in the immediate when I'm in the classroom and I have concerns about a young person? I will share this link with our wonderful team at Seton Hall, or pardon me, the slides. I'll share that with them so that they can share it with you, because there's a number of embedded hyperlinks here at the end regarding other resources, so that way you have it on hand and you can peruse it if you so choose. So with that, I think we're going to transition to some time for small group discussion. Yeah.